Tomorrow Never Knows with me, Bob Wilson, and Sir Warren Brown of the Beatles Kingdom. Our extra special guest today we're honored to have is Ivor Davis. He's an author and friend of the lads. So greetings, everyone.
Greetings, Ivor.
Thank you for your greetings. Greetings from me. Can we spend 30 minutes probably saying greetings to me, greetings to you?
There you
that,
go.
that's all right with me. That'll sell a lot of books.
Yes, it will. It will.
All right, good.
Hello, Warren. And, I should interrupt you before you ask a question. Whenever I need, when you reach a certain age like me, you forget things. So whenever I need to check something, I check with Beatle magazine. I think, where the heck was I? 1964, September. I check Beatle magazine and it tells me where I was.
That is great. I'm sure they're going to love you for that.
That's supposed to be.
Yes, it is. Thank you for that, Ivor.
Sure.
My first question is: you're an author of many books and are the Beatles insider. Please tell us about your career in journalism and about the books you have written, please.
Of course. Well, I was working for a big London newspaper called the London Daily Express, and I always like to say 4.5 million people read the newspaper every day, but because in those days people read newspapers. And my newspaper sent me all over the world on stories. I became West Coast of America correspondent in the early 60s, and one of the first big stories they sent me on, and they said, the editor called me, David English, and he said, get on the first plane. He told me what time it was leaving. Get to San Francisco. The boys are arriving, and you are traveling with them on their first American tour. I said, wow, that sounds kind of interesting. It's another routine assignment. It wasn't another routine assignment because I spent nearly 6 weeks with them on the road all over North America. And I also wrote George Harrison's column. George was a lovely fellow, much shyer than he became later in life. And so it was hard for me to pull information out of George. But I was his ghostwriter, and I traveled with them in limo number 2. They were in limo number 1. I traveled with them on their great rented, chartered jet with Jackie DeShannon and the Beatles and their roadies. And it was a incredible, and I always say this, corny as it was a ticket to ride that I will never forget.
Good explanation, good description. That must have been really an honor. That was really nice. The shows that you've seen must have been so exciting. Will you tell us about what they were like for you?
Well, I want to tell you, and I've talked to the Beatles since then. I must tell you, Warren, I could barely hear the Beatles singing. I sat in the front row. I sat in the front row, but you know why I couldn't hear the Beatles singing? Take a guess. Take a guess. The Beatles stepped on the stage, and then what happened?
The girl started screaming.
You've got it. Were you there? Were you in the row when? Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Absolutely right.
I can only wish I was there. That's all. I'm going to go through my imagination as you tell me this, and I can just imagine it all.
Well, it was an amazing journey because, frankly, I mean, believe it or not only could I not hear them because of the screaming girls that started the moment they stepped on the stage and they left. The screaming was ceaseless. You can't believe 17, 25,000 screaming young women. It takes your eardrums off. It beats you up. And the Beatles couldn't hear themselves singing. And Ringo said very often, because of the noise, he didn't know what song they were playing. So he learned to lip read. And so he realized they were singing It's a Hard Day's Night when they were singing It's a Hard Day's Night, and they were not singing I Want to Hold Your Hand. But he got confused, and that was the pattern of every single concert. Every city we went to, from New York to LA to the Hollywood Bowl to Shea Stadium.
Wow. That must have been great. Yeah, I heard or read about Ringo saying that he used to figure out what song they were singing and and where they were at in the song by the actions of Paul and John.
Yes, and then Ringo became quite a terrific lip reader. So if you talk to him today, he'll tell you about his skills as a lip reader, which served him very well. Because, you know, if he was beating the rhythm on the drum to one song and they were singing another song, it got a bit embarrassing. However, don't forget, Warren, we couldn't hear much. They couldn't hear much. Nobody could hear much. And the other important thing you've got to remember is back in 1964, 65, and 66, the sound systems were terrible.
Yeah, I can just imagine that. I actually wouldn't want to be at one of those concerts because of all the screaming and the noise. And they did say it didn't matter what they were playing because they couldn't hear if they were playing it right anyway. And
Yes.
as far as I know, that's one of the reasons why they quit touring.
Warren, you're absolutely right. John, at the last week of the tour, said that he wanted to quit touring because he said the audiences don't come along to hear us; they come along to see us. And
Exactly.
John said, I feel like we've become a traveling freak show. Nobody wants to hear our music; they just want to see us, and we want them to hear our music. So there was a conflict there, and when they finally broke up, as I'm sure you know, that was one of the key reasons why. And the other concert tours that I want to ask you a question, Warren, was can you take a guess? How long do you think the Beatles performed at every concert on their first North American tour? Take a guess.
Oh, that's a good question. I'm going to take a guess because I don't really know, but I'm going to say 2 hours.
Well, you know, you're a little wrong. How about 27 to 28 minutes?
Wow.
Yeah, because they did their songs bang, bang, bang. There was no chit chat except when John said, and here's a song from our latest movie, our first movie, A Hard Day's Night. They never conversed with the audience. And can you imagine audiences paying to go and see a top flight rock group for less than half an hour? Now, if I may add this, Warren, I mentioned that to Paul McCartney when I saw him in San Diego in the summer of this year. And Paul said, when I asked him, are you going to play longer than 30 minutes? He said, you wait and see. And Paul played for 3 hours and 10 minutes. He never left the stage.
Wow.
And he sang 38 songs. So things have changed a bit.
Yes, they have. The last time I seen Paul, I think he played for 2.5 to 3 hours also. So, yes, times have changed, that's for sure.
Yeah, I must add one more thing, Warren. When I had a conversation with Paul backstage in San Diego, California, just a few weeks ago, I said to him, when you and I and the other guys traveled, you had two roadies. I said, now, when you travel around the world, do you have more than two roadies? And how many roadies and assistants and help does he get on the worldwide tour? Take a guess of how many people he needs.
He probably needs about 100 at least.
Well, you're close. 93.
Wow.
93. And it's amazing. But you know, you travel instead of traveling in a beat up old van as they did in their early days. Paul rents and takes over a jumbo jet for his gang. So
right,
it's a lot different.
Yeah, Mount Evans had a hard job back then.
Well, Mal was the guy. Mal was the schlepper. He was the carrier, and the other guy carried everything. Those little Mickey Mouse loudspeakers and their instruments was of course Neil Aspinall. And as every Beatle fan knows, Neil went on to become the big boss of Apple Records.
When the shows were over, you were sort of trapped in a hotel. What did you do to pass the time? Were you a big Monopoly player?
Well, I should tell you that when the shows were over, as soon as they finished, as soon as I heard Long Tall Sally, I never heard the rest of the song because I had to rush back to limo number 2 because I knew that Long Tall Sally was the last song in their gig. And so there I was in the warmed up limo waiting for the Beatles to rush out, jump into limo number 1, and off we went. Now, I got to tell you this story because I'm sure you know it and many fans know it. The Beatles used to do little subterfuges to get away from the concert hall. A limo was a giveaway. So they got away in ambulances and in fire trucks, and on one occasion in Chicago in a refrigerated meat truck. So they had to get away. And don't forget, they couldn't go to dinner at the local hotshot restaurant. They had to go straight back to the hotel where they were trapped. They were trapped because as soon as they got to their hotel, thousands of young women gathered outside. So what would happen was we would eat with them in their rooms, and John would invite myself and Arthur Schreiber, who was the Westinghouse radio reporter. Arthur Schreiber was the political editor of Westinghouse, and all of a sudden he's called and told to travel with these guys from Liverpool. Well, Arthur said, "This is beneath me. I'm a political reporter." But I'll tell you this. By the time Arthur finished the tour, he was a fan of the Beatles and he knew a lot about the Beatles. So I'm deviating a little bit, Warren. Getting back to your question, we were trapped in every hotel, in every city. The Beatles couldn't go outside. And so we had dinner with them. We raided their mini bar and I played Monopoly with Arthur at 2 o'clock in the morning with John Lennon. And John, of course, as everybody knows, was a big cheat on Monopoly. And he used to roll the dice all the time until he landed on the property he wanted. Being a cheat at Monopoly, Warren, he was a nice guy. He was a wonderful guy and a witty guy.
Well, I know from past experiences playing Monopoly, if somebody don't cheat, that game can go on forever.
Yes. Well, there you go. That could have been it. And the other thing that I remember of those nights of Monopoly was that in the middle of the game, John would call home to Liverpool to talk to his son, who was a baby, and John would goo goo gaga on the telephone in the middle of a game of the Monopoly while we just listened to one end of the conversation. But it was memorable times and one that one does not forget.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys know what a caged animal feels like. That's for sure. I would have hated that.
Yes, absolutely.
I guess that's why John liked New York so much, because he could walk down the street and not be mobbed by a bunch of people.
Well, what happened at the end of the tour, Warren, was that when I spoke to John about what he liked about America, he said he liked America, but he never saw it. He said, my only regret after the first American tour was that we never got to see anything. I mean, in Vegas, they didn't go anywhere. They went from hotel to airport, and from airport to the auditorium. And John wanted to see more. And as you pointed out, that's why when he went to New York, he liked to walk around the streets of New York.
Right. Yeah. I can just imagine that, not going around the world and not being able to walk around and actually see the world. So, yeah, that must have hurt for all of those guys.
Yeah.
Do you have occasion to stay in touch with the group after the 64 tour?
Yeah, after the 64 tour, I did keep in touch through my very good late friend, Derek Taylor. Now, as you know, Derek was the brilliant, brilliant publicist for the Beatles on the
Hmm.
tour in 1964. And he was also a sort of a personal assistant to Brian Epstein. And so I kept in touch when George came to Hollywood or to California to promote an album. I would see George and Derek. And then I saw Ringo when he came to America to be, believe it or not, part of a children's program for PBS television. And I
Hmm.
spent a little bit of time with him then. And of course, I saw Paul McCartney when he was married to Linda, when Paul came to Hollywood to promote his Oscar chances to win for the movie Live and Let Die. He wrote the music for that. He got nominated for an Oscar. I spent some time with him at the Beverly Hills Hotel that year. He was nominated for an Oscar. Spent time with he and Linda, and Paul didn't win the Oscar. But so from that point of view, although we are in absolutely no way bosom buddies, I did get a chance to renew the friendship or the acquaintanceship, if you like, with them after the tour.
Right. Are you still friends, or do you still remain friends with Paul and Ringo?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm friends. I would say that when, for example, Paul performed at the San Diego Petco Stadium in the summer of this year, I went backstage to see him and we chatted about the old days.
Hmm.
Ringo, I've seen perform with his all-star band. And to be honest with you, when I was going to go backstage to say hello, there were about 100 people lined up to say hello. And so I just sent a note and said, see you next time.
Right. Yeah, that's a shame though, because you really did a lot with those guys, and they deserve to say hi to you, and you deserve to say hi to them, and bring up old times.
I think people like that.
Yeah,
And the Beatles like that because I was around way back when. But
exactly.
like we all get on with our lives, you know, and we all
Mm,
have friendships and our careers and other things to do and other activities. But they always have a very fond place in my heart. And
right.
you know, I learn new things about the Beatles almost every day, believe it or not. And I must add this: I go. I mean, look, talking to you is
Mm,
bringing it up. Talking to Bob, talking to you know people like Jude Sutherland,
right.
Kessler. I
Hmm.
mean, you end up, strangely enough, with a new sort of surrogate family because of John, Paul, George, and Ringo. The
Right.
connections are amazing. If you ever go, and I'm sure you've been to the Beatle Fest that Mark Lapidus puts on, I mean, it's fun because you get to meet everybody associated in any way with the Beatles, and it's kind of like reunion week.
Great stories here, Ivor. I am enjoying it all. With that being said, I'm going to hand it off to the Bulldog. We call him the Bulldog because of his initials. I'll let him explain that, but I'm going to say, hey, Bulldog, your turn.
Hello, Sir Warren. Yes, my name is Bob Douglas, so that's the BD for Bulldog.
thought I thought, to be honest with you, that you were going to Warren say that the reason he has that nickname is because he's so bloody tenacious.
That's because he barks all the time. He
Ah,
growls, he barks.
Like America Bulldog.
okay, got it.
Well, the new book is very serious. Manson exposed the reporter's 50-year journey into madness and murder by our guest Ivor Davis. This isn't just a book for Ivor. He was, intricately involved in all the things that were happening up close. He's, in my opinion, very brave and was involved in the cases and involved from just about day one. And he stuck it out for the whole trial, so he has insight we don't have. and he put himself on the line when he was doing that, and I find him to be very humble. And I almost have to urge him to put the humbleness aside to tell us how deep he was in this case. But can you tell us, you were in the right place at the right time often, in a sense, for history. How did you become involved in the events that happened with the Manson family and these things? And how were you drawn into it?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there, Bob. As a reporter covering the big stories in America, particularly on the West Coast, when the Manson murders, and it wasn't called the Manson murders on day one, it was called the Who murdered them. Nobody knew. Who murdered Sharon Tate and who murdered her friends and who murdered the La Biancas. So it was a big story, and my job was to stay on top of the big stories. And so I was a fairly tenacious bulldog of a reporter. Sorry, bulldog of a reporter. And so I followed the case very, very closely every single day. And from day one, it was fascinating. It was horrible. It was just everything you wanted a big story to be. And I stayed with it for 50 years.
Now, still as you talk, you remain a little humble because you make it sound like you were just following the events from a distance, but you really weren't. I'll move deeper into that as we go along. But can you tell us about the first book written on this case, which was by yourself, and Five to Die? And how did that tie in with the prosecution's idea for a motive in this case, which was, because we've spoken about it intricately involved with your book. So you're not a reporter looking in at facts and doodling in a notebook. I mean, you're right in the heart of everything that's going on with the prosecution and covering the case.
Well, here's what happened in a nutshell. As soon as the world knew that Charles Manson was involved in the murders, and the first time the name Manson was publicly thrown around the world was in December of 1969, which is 50 years ago this year. And nobody knew who the killers were. And then the cops in December 1969 had a press conference, which I went to, in which they said, here are the names of the suspects, and they all live on a movie ranch where the cult leader is a guy called Charles Manson. And as soon as I heard that, I thought, well, this is unbelievable. So I raced to the movie ranch called the Spahn Movie Ranch, and I was very lucky because I ran into several members of the Manson family who were no longer members of the Manson family, were never involved in the murders, and they, over a period of several days, told me the amazing story of Manson, the way he held tight control over these young women and young men, and also the story that I couldn't believe, that he had brainwashed every member of the Manson family, the young people, to believe, and can you believe, that the Beatles' White Album songs like Helter Skelter was a blueprint to start a race war and was the reason why Manson sent his young killers out to murder. Well, I must say, you know the background. I've told you the background to my Beatle experience. I thought it was hogwash, but I got this incredible story, and before the trial began in July of 1970, I wrote Five to Die, outlining the anatomy of the murders, the Beatles' involvement or alleged involvement, and the book Five to Die came out before the trial. And when the trial began, the district attorney, Vincent Bugliosi, used the Beatles Made Me Do It synopsis for his reason for the killings. I still thought it was crazy, but this is what he used. And so the reason he used it, I was told, was that I had mentioned chapter and verse Helter Skelter Rocky Raccoon, Revolution, all the songs in the White Album as being the reason why Manson encouraged his guys and girls to kill. And the district attorney, I learned years later, decided that was the motive he was going to use. And he did use it. And he used it devastatingly, effectively, so much so that, as everybody in the world knows, Manson and his acolytes were convicted of first-degree murder and sent to the gas chamber. Of course, 1971, after the convictions, the death penalty was abolished. And so Manson remained in prison for the rest of his life and came up for parole with the girls every 4 years. And in a way, that's why we're talking about Manson, because it was his road to horrible fame. So that was the brief, as succinct as I can make it, story of going to the Spahn Ranch, hearing about the motives for the murders, publishing a book, and learning that the district attorney had used my book as a sort of guide to the prosecution.
Now, when you went out to the was it Spahn Ranch where the interview happened?
Yes.
I just wasn't sure if it was a different location, so I didn't want to make a mistake. But when you went out there, you basically went by yourself to the place where these people were living. So I can't imagine the level of courage that takes.
Well, the point was a reporter, just a young reporter, just thinking, well, look, who is this guy Manson? What is behind this awful series of murders, if indeed he is guilty? And so you do, as a reporter, you go to the scene of the crime, or you go to the scene of the hatching of the crime. And so I went out to the Spahn Ranch, not really knowing what it would be like. And I must say, for many of your listeners, the Spahn Ranch is depicted vividly and accurately in Quentin Tarantino's current movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So if anybody sees that film, and I have no interest no profit from talking about the film, but if you see that movie, when they go to the Spahn movie ranch, it is eerie and scary, and it's exactly the way I saw it, and exactly the way I found it. Not very welcoming, but I needed to go back in 1969 to get to the root of the story.
And and to your courage, credit, you had the courage to do that. When you went out and had the interview, I think Squeaky Fromm was listening to you interview the other gentleman, and at some point she made a threat to you. I was just again, it's an ugly story, but quite frightening. But I applaud your courage. But could you tell us a little bit about Squeaky Fromm?
Well, first of all, I'm going to argue the point. I don't think I was courageous. I mean, I was just doing what reporters are supposed to do. But when I went to the Spahn Ranch, and when I interviewed Squeaky slightly, because she didn't want to tell me much, she kept telling me how Charlie was innocent, and this was a terrible thing that Charlie was arrested and he would be back with them very shortly once the truth was known. But I got the other story from those who were not under his spell. So when I wrote the book, and on the first day of the trial, Squeaky, who was a devoted follower of Charlie all through the trial and for 50 years plus, still is a devotee of Manson, Squeaky confronted me outside the courtroom and threatened to stick a knife down my throat, which I didn't take too lightly. I gathered that was a bit of a threat. And then, as most people remember, Squeaky, several years later, was arrested for trying to assassinate President Gerald Ford. So Squeaky was not squeaky clean. She was a little bit of a menace, and she's still around today. And if she's listening, and I'm sure she is, get over it. Get real. Too late now, I'm afraid.
Well, fellas, do you know where I go for all my things Beatles, when I want to find the latest information on what's going on with the lads. Warren, do you know where I go?
Could it be Beatles magazine?
Beatles Magazine, you say? It's a publication with 370 million plus visitors in all their pages, read by thousands of fans around the world each and every day. There's Beatle news updated 24 hours with audio, video, photos, interviews, contests, you say, additional material, and more. So follow Beatles Magazine, the most complete online coverage, 24 hours a day. And Warren, how many days a week?
8 days a week, Sir
8
Bob.
days a week it is. So did you have occasion to speak as you know, Vincent Bugliosi is reading your book and he's coming up with his case and he's leaning heavily on your research. Did you meet with him and did he ask you about the book? Did you have sessions where you were talking together?
Well, I wish I could say it was true, but Vincent came up with his own theory. I mean, Vincent was a very talented, hardworking, driven district attorney. And once he took over the case, he, according to the police, solved it single-handedly. Now, Vincent was a great lawyer, a great prosecutor, not a very modest man. And so I learned years later from one of his assistants that Vince took credit for everything. So he and I never sat down to talk about my book. I know he had it. I knew he used it. I had it first-hand source from the office. But then several years later, I ran into Vince. And I'd written about Vince, and I'd written about him running for district attorney of LA, and it wasn't a very positive story. And Vince said to me at a party in Hollywood, hello again, Ivor. I said, hi, Vince, how are you doing? He said, do you still hate me? I said, Vince, I do not hate you. I just wrote the truth. But Vince had a very sensitive ego. There are many stories about that sensitive ego. And Mr. Tom O'Neill in his book, which is a very good book, Chaos, talks about confronting Mr. Bugliosi with a few questions that didn't fit the Vince propaganda. And Vince got very angry and very upset at Mr. O'Neill's questions. And that was exactly what Vince was like. If you were on his team, he expected you to obey his every command because he was the kingpin. As I say, a great lawyer, did his job, worked 25 hours a day, but, had his ego problems. And so our relationship during the trial was very rocky. And the relationship with Vince Bugliosi and every reporter on the trial was rocky because Vince wanted them to write what he wanted them to write, and they were writing their own opinions and their own versions of the story.
Now, the cover to Manson Exposed, your new book, A Reporter's 50-Year Journey into Madness and Murder, I mention again, has a very intense photograph, a close-up picture of Charles Manson's face, which is, I don't think anybody can look at it without being disturbed, that picture. You were in the courtroom when he was there pulling different shenanigans, and you got to see his behavior firsthand. What was it like to be in the courtroom with this man, knowing what he was capable of? Any vibrations he gave off, any anecdotes that come to your mind?
Well, the interesting thing about that trial was it was never routine. I mean, one day Charlie screamed at the judge. Another day he jumped at the judge with a pencil, threatening to kill him with a sharp pencil. He was rugby tackled by the bailiff. Another day he showed up with a swastika. Another day he insulted the judge. I mean, it was just an unpredictable flying circus is what I call it. Ridiculous. But the other thing that I noticed in nearly a year of close up watching Manson and the girls was that Manson liked to play games. He liked to give people the evil eye. If a young, attractive woman came sitting in the first few rows, Charlie would kind of try and outstare this new person and scare this new person. It happened very often, and I must say, he had very sharp, deep, penetrating, mesmerizing eyes. There's no doubt. Look at that picture that you've just mentioned. It's an uncanny gaze, and he tried to use it on people, and it worked on many people. And in the courtroom, Manson played by Manson rules. That didn't please the judge, and that's why the trial went on for nearly a year.
And the people you mentioned, like this sway he had over people, or you allude to it. You were there and you saw these people. You're a very intelligent man, and I just wonder, like, what your thoughts are, and how does someone come to have such control over another human being? And some of these people I guess it was a mix, but some were said to be like prom queens or valedictorians. Not every one of them, but some of them. How does someone like him come to have this power sway to get people to do, follow him like that, and for some of them to commit such atrocious acts that it's hard to wrap your mind around them?
Well, you've got to realize that Charles Manson grew up as a young man in reform schools, spent most of his life in reform schools, and he ended up with a lot of criminals who would have beaten the hell out of him, but he was able to be glib, and he was able to talk his way out of trouble. And that prison education for most of his life served him in good stead, because it made him glib. It made him have the savvy to realize that he could tell people what he knew they wanted to hear. And by doing that, he could mesmerize them, and he could keep the peace, and he could avoid getting beaten the hell out of him. So when he came out of jail as a veteran, wizened in his 30s, wizened survivor of the prison system, and ran into these young people. Many of them were bright. Many of them were, as you pointed out, good students. Some of them were runaways. They were all looking for the answer to the meaning of life. And somehow Manson honed in like a kind of a missile on each of these people. He told them what they wanted to hear. And they just fell apart. They said, oh my God, this guy knows the answers. And that was part of his magic. He was like a magician. He conned them. He talked to them like a father. He was their father. He was their dictator. And I say he was their lover in many cases. So they fell for his con tricks. And this is what he was good at. I mean, look at him on television. Look at him on YouTube. Look at him talking to veteran interviewers like Diane Sawyer and Tom Snyder. And you will see that he's an actor. He's a theatrical performer, giving them what they want. And it's fascinating to watch those interviews. And before I wrote my book, I watched every interview and marveled at the magic and the cleverness and the craftiness that Manson was able to cook up. And it worked. It worked with television interviewers, and it worked with these young, unhappy kids who thought they found the Messiah, but instead they found a monster.
And, as you eloquently describe how he had this sway over them, he also had this sway over some important people. Say Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. He was in the, in their in with them. Lived in Dennis Wilson's house. Also Terry Melcher and different people who were really, the top line of the stars and musicians of the day. So his powers even worked upward. Just your thoughts, because when people interview sometimes, you were actually there, we weren't. So what I want to come away with is your thoughts, not just what I've read or studied.
Yeah. Well, years after Manson was sent to prison and convicted, I spoke and interviewed Terry Melcher. And Terry Melcher, for those of your listeners who don't know, was a record producer with the knew everybody in the 60s and the 70s. He just was top of the heap. He was Doris Day's son. He had good connections to show business. And somehow, and here's how the somehow worked, he was visiting his friend Dennis Wilson, the drummer of the Beach Boys. Dennis Wilson, the drummer of the Beach Boys, had become enchanted by Charlie Manson after picking up a couple of his girls who were hitchhiking on Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu. Cut a long story short, Manson and the girls move into Dennis Wilson's house, and Dennis Wilson lets them stay there, gives them the run of the place, and he also invites the showbiz greats of Hollywood rock and roll, the Beach Boys, Mike Love, the Mamas and the Papas, John Phillips and Mama Cass, to the house that Dennis owned where they could meet Manson. And Manson performed for them. So we have a situation where Charlie uses the same magic on these people. Terry Melcher said to me, I thought of recording Charlie, giving him a contract. I decided not to. And I thought, why don't we do a documentary on this guy? Because when I went out to the Spahn Ranch, there were Charlie and these girls living off the land. And what a marvelous story. So he was enchanted. The enchantment turned sour. So did the enchantment turn sour with Dennis Wilson. Dennis had given Charlie that running of his house, but then Charlie just decided that Dennis Wilson took a song from Charlie, Ceased to Exist, never gave Charlie credit. Charlie was furious and they fell out. So Charlie Manson, in his journey to become a rock star, courted and was nice to, absolutely mesmerized these people. And they were in his life, and they very quickly, once they found the truth about him, walked away, turned their back.
Now, aside from the horror of the murders, which is an obvious answer which I understand and I sympathize with, and I ask delicately about, but what I wonder is some of these people, and they were close to a murder, hence that may be the only answer. But it just seems like there was a real shutdown of anyone talking about what was behind some of these things. If they knew Manson, was there more to it? I don't know if drugs were involved, things like that. But, the obvious answer again would be that this was a horrible murder. But it just seems like a lot of Hollywood shut down and just didn't speak of this. A lot of these guys wouldn't give any interviews about it. I don't presume to be in their position and understand their feelings, but I wonder about it. I was just wondering your thoughts on that. I don't mean to be presumptuous.
Well, let me just say that I was talking to a well-known producer-director who's doing a documentary now for television that will be airing in 2020, early in 2020. And she told me that she went to many people, Warren Beatty. I mean, this is 50 odd years later. And she wanted to talk to them on camera about Manson and about the atmosphere. And these people, Warren Beatty and several others, just don't want to bring it up again. I mean, they say, well, I don't want to talk about it. If we talk about it, it will just reinvigorate interest in Manson. Of course, that's their reason. So there are a lot of people who were involved with Manson that now, even today, don't want to talk about him. There are people that will talk about him, and anybody that's seen the many documentaries on Manson will see that there are quite a few people talking about Manson today, because now he's dead, of course. So the threat is gone, supposedly. So the answer to your question, in a way, is that even today there are people who find it so hateful and so awful to have to recreate their memories of that awful time that they just don't want to have anything to do with it. So I think that's part of the reason that some people still have tight lips and won't talk about men.
Do you think that there is, like in terms of, I don't know, parties, I'm speculating, admittedly, I'm just probing a little bit. But was he involved with them in other ways, maybe providing women, providing drugs? Were they maybe involved in some way with that? I'm just asking because
Yeah,
I'm
well,
curious.
here's the background to this. Now, when Charles Manson in 1968 moved in with Dennis Wilson to his mansion on Sunset Boulevard, he moved in with the girls, and Charlie bought drugs, and Charlie brought free sex to Dennis Wilson's house. Now, I'm just assuming, possibly, that some famous people, and I won't name names even after all these years, and I think you know who I'm referring to, but some famous people went to Charlie Manson's parties and availed themselves of the free sex. There's a guy whose name I forget now, who was the road manager for the Rolling Stones, and you probably remember his name, and I write about him. But he said that when the Manson girls were arrested, he looked at the newspaper and he looked at their names and said, "Hey, I've slept with every one of them." He was an ex-prison mate of Manson who came out, became fairly successful in the rock and roll world. But he said, he availed himself of free sex. And I believe other big names availed themselves of Charlie's offer. I mean, Charlie was the pimp. Charlie was the girl. Charlie was the guy who told the girls who to sleep with and who not to sleep with, and they obeyed him. So there was a thought of blackmail. If many of these famous people talked about it, then Charlie had the goods on them, and he would have blackmailed them and used the idea that they had sex with his young women to destroy their careers.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you for that insight. And since you were, friendly and an acquaintance of the Beatles, and I was wondering what a horrible thing to have happened that you write a song innocently, and then it gets tied into something like this that you could never expect or possibly see coming. I was just wondering what thoughts they might have expressed to you about, having the White Album song so twisted by someone who was obviously, insane and had such sway over the people to do these things. How could they react? But what did you come away with from what they felt about this?
Well, let me just give a little quick background. Well, first of all, I appreciate you saying how close I am to the Beatles, but I'm not really close to them. I'm just one of the passing clouds that happened to be in their focus for a short while. But I can tell you that after the trial, I did talk to John Lennon and I did talk to Paul McCartney and about the Manson connection. And first of all, John was horrified to be linked and horrified that he and Paul's music, Helter Skelter, and the other songs were supposedly, the reason behind the killings. And the first time I spoke to John when he was living in LA with May Pang after he split up from Yoko for 18 months, he was very reluctant to even talk about the subject. But then when I told John, who was staying in the house of Lou Adler, the record producer, I should say, when he was staying in Lou Adler's house, I went to see him and started talking about Manson and the music and the Beatles' White Album. And John did not want to talk about it. But then when I told John that I had covered the trial, I was very familiar with the case, I'd written a book, he opened up and said, he said this was lunacy. He said there's no way on earth that any of the music can be construed as a black-white revolution, blacks killing whites, carnage, murder, bloodshed, stabbing, nothing. And so the rest of the Beatles felt the same way. I know Paul felt the same way, and so did George, who was very friendly with Roman Polanski, the husband of Sharon Tate. And Sharon Tate was murdered. Roman Polanski was in London at the time. And they all were absolutely horrified by the mere mention of the fact that their music had in any way to do with this terrible series of murders.
Well, of course, the songs, weren't about that, and most people grasp that. It's just a shame that it's linked to their wonderful music. Was the other person you were alluding to, was the music executive that you had mentioned before, Phil Kaufman? He had been
Yes,
in jail, I
yes,
think, with Charlie Manson.
yes, you're right. Phil Kaufman's name has escaped me, but you're right. Now, Phil Kaufman met Charlie Manson in Terminal Island jail, prison, and he was Kaufman was in for some fairly minor drug infraction, and of course, when Manson met Kaufman in prison, they hit it off because Manson was musically inclined, and Kaufman knew his business in the music industry, and so it was Kaufman. Excuse me. It was Kaufman who actually introduced Charlie Manson to some of his record producer pals at Universal Studios, and indeed Manson, through the connection of Kaufman, went to Universal Studios and made a record, and then of course, as the world knows, Charlie Manson ended up trying to make a record at Brian Wilson's house, at his recording studio. The recordings he made were not very good. The recordings he made were not good because Charlie would not follow instructions from the engineers, and they ended up walking away in anger. And so it was Kaufman that was Charlie Manson's ticket to a lot of showbiz people and to getting a recording. And it was, as I said earlier, Dennis Wilson's largesse, Dennis Wilson's hospitality, Dennis Wilson's generosity in letting Manson stay at his house that got Charlie Manson a connection with Terry Melcher and a lot of other people in the rock and roll world.
No, I believe Wilson himself had been threatened, and I believe Melcher and a lot of people in this. But when did the family go, in your estimation? Or maybe they never did. Maybe they were always that way. But did it go for a time where it was like living in a commune, and then all of a sudden it was, from watching the movies, reading the books, listening to accounts, I'm distanced from it. Well, you're closer. But it seems at some point a switch was thrown. And all of a sudden these people went from, following him blindly in a commune, and all of a sudden you had people who were ready to murder in a really horrible way. I was wondering if there was a point, as you look at the case, where it suddenly seemed to change.
Well, I think there was a series of incidents that led to Charles Manson almost going crazy and ordering the murders. And what happened was, number one of his pals, Bobby Beausoleil, was arrested for the murder of musician Gary Hinman. Gary Hinman was murdered on the orders of Charles Manson. And then Bobby Beausoleil, who'd done the murders at Manson's suggestion and orders, was arrested and faced a life sentence or death sentence. So Charlie got a little bit guilty about that, and he wanted to try and get Bobby Beausoleil out of prison. And in his crackpot mind, Manson cooked up the idea of doing copycat killings, ordering copycat killings, Sharon Tate's house, the LaBianca's house, in the belief that the cops investigating the murder of Gary Hinman would say, Bobby Beausoleil is in jail. He could not have murdered Sharon Tate. He could not have murdered the LaBiancas, which had the same modus operandi. And so the cops would then say that Bobby Beausoleil was not guilty. So Manson did this. He also did this murder because he thought he had killed a drug dealer called Bernard Lotzapopper Crow, who he did shoot Lotzapopper Crow in the belly with a gun. He did think that Crow was dead. He did think that Crow was a black militant panther who would seek revenge on the Manson family and come to the ranch and kill everyone. And all those little side shows added up to Manson's megalomania, Manson's maniacal idea to set up new murders, Sharon Tate, LaBianca's, to throw people off the scent And at the same time, Manson was not thinking clearly. Manson ordered the murders with that crackpot scheme I've just outlined to you in very brief detail. So he was going crazy, and the murders took place, and then he was arrested 9 days later, but they let him go. They let him go because they didn't know he was the killer. They let him go because they'd arrested him for stealing cars. And Manson realized he'd escaped a possible murder arrest. So with the rest of the family, he headed off to Death Valley, where they were going to find a hidden underground city and live happily ever after. I mean, it's all a bit crazy, but that's the genesis of the background to why Manson launched his carnage campaign.
No, it seems as I go over it in my mind, and we talk about his sway over people, like one of the things is obviously women and sex. And the other thing, as he's losing his mind, it seems to me he's becoming unraveled if I read into it a little bit. The use of acid and the use of speed, or a very strong form of speed, it seems to have a very bad effect on people when you use that over time. I was just wondering at the trial or just in discussions, did that ever come up? Like the amount of drugs they were doing just, seemed to have warped them.
Well, during the trial, there was a lot of evidence of a lot of drug taking. When I went to the Spahn Ranch and spoke to Paul Watkins and Brooks Poston and a couple of other members of the Manson family, they said that Charlie daily handed out LSD, obviously marijuana, mescaline, and a variety of drugs like candy. And so for most of the time, many members of the family, including those involved in the killings, were definitely high. I mean, Tex Watson got so high, Charles Tex Watson, who led the killers to Sharon Tate's house and did most of the killing and is still in jail. Tex Watson was absolutely zonked out of his mind, I have no doubt. In fact, many times when Watson got so high on drugs, he'd put his fist through a door or he'd smash the car. So their behavior was completely out of control. And in a way, Manson very cleverly manipulated them. He never took heavy drugs, although he did take drugs, but he handed out more drugs than he imbibed himself. So Manson knew that drugs was a way to help control these young people.
Now, the anniversary is coming up that you spoke of before. That'll be the 50th year, I believe, of them being named as suspects. And I was just thinking, we mentioned Squeaky Frome. With all this time that's gone by, it just boggles my mind. Like, I don't have an answer. But the question is in my mind, how could someone still hear the horror of what had happened and still call themselves, quote, loyal to this man, Manson? It just seems, if he had any hope to even be a songwriter, when these things broke, it was over. Once you started killing all these people, anybody who's in their right mind, and perhaps even he had no clue at this point. But it's just with this case, it's, justice was served, they were put in jail. But when you see the cover of your book, it's such a horrible murder. And I think sometimes when we hear of these killings and we think of a reason, it gives us some solace. We know why. And then when they're punished for what they did, you hope they rehabilitate, but, punished for what they did for the people who lost their lives, it gives you a sense of justice. In this case, even this much, this far into the future now, 50 years coming up, as I discuss this, I get a chill more so than any other true crime case that I can think of. And some of the answers, you've gone through, but what is it about this case that could still frighten us today, 50 years later, as we discuss it? I do feel a little trepidation when I talk about this, I admit.
Well, there are still a very small handful of women who still believe that Charlie Manson got a bum rap. And Charlie Manson, as you know from many of the interviews that he gave on television and off television, always claimed that he never murdered anyone. So there's always going to be a sort of a remnant, a skeletal crew of true believers. The problem, in a way, is bringing it right up to date is that today, and I read about it every day, nearly every day, that there are these messiahs, these gurus, these leaders, or call them what you like, who come up with a new set of rules, a new set of crackpot thinking. And there are people out there who still want to hear, as I say, the meaning of life. And if some new guru comes up with the answer, there's somebody that's prepared to swallow the poison, and they do. And I read about it all the time, and it's happening. And the problem is that, to answer your question and sort of bring it full circle, the whole Manson thing is so horrendous. So many people died, innocent people died, the ones we know about, because they ran across the Manson path. They may have offended him. They may have upset him. Who knows? You can only speculate. But can it happen again? People worry. And even when I wrote my new book with Manson Exposed, several people said, well, I'm interested in the book, but it's too scary. I don't want to read it. I'm not going to read it. And so the name conjures up like Jack the Ripper almost, although Jack the Ripper is out of our lifetime. This is in our lifetime, in most of our lifetimes. And I mean, of course, if you were born after 1999, you may not know who Manson is, but I guess books like mine and miniseries and films keep the name alive. And it's one of the most notorious names in criminal history of the past 100 years. And I don't know, 100 years from now, if we talk, most people may have forgotten Manson. I hope so.
Well, he reminds me, if I may, speculate a bit. When I think of him on a much smaller scale, of course, Hitler had painting and Charlie had music. And when I look at him, it's the same ugly feeling I get in my soul when I see a picture of Hitler and I see a picture of Manson. It dawned on me subconsciously that as soon as I think of him, in the back of my mind, I was relating to Adolf Hitler. And that didn't happen with any other individual I see a picture of. So he really did leave a horrible mark. But your book tells the story. Manson Exposed, the Reporter's 50-Year Journey into Madness and Murder. I recommend it as highly as I could. I've read it twice. I know you told the story well, but is there anything that you hope people come away with when they're done with the book? A healing, possibly, anything that comes to your mind?
Well, you mentioned Hitler. Now, Hitler got millions of people to follow his harebrained, horrendous propaganda. Manson, I suppose, affected so many people, and also many people died senselessly as a result of him, as a result of his teachings or his schemes or whatever you want to call it. I don't think my book or any book about Manson is a psychological study of the brain of the man, what made him happen, why. Whenever I go on the road promoting the book, people ask me, what's his background? I mean, and I tell them the history of being abandoned, neglected as a child. But I also point out, and I'm sure you know this, that there are thousands, millions maybe, of young men and women who got a terrible childhood, but they didn't turn out to be mass murderers. So there's no lesson really to be learned except question people if they tell you they know the answer to life. Don't be so bloody gullible. Try and use common sense. But I guess we'd be having this conversation now, and next year a new Manson will emerge, except his name will be not Manson, it will be something else. So it's the way life is, and because I'm not a shrink, I can't offer any brilliant thesis about what you should learn by this. Perhaps you could get a good psychologist in your next show to go into Manson, look at him, and give me a few of the answers.
Well, you said you're not brave, but I disagree. Most brave people don't call themselves brave, but I think you are. I also think you're highly intelligent and you're an excellent journalist and writer. And I hand over to Warren with some more questions, and I thank you.
Thank you. Flattery.
Very amazing stories and interesting times you were in, Ivor.
Yes. No, I was very fortunate. Yeah.
Yes. I'm going to regress a little bit here because I got a couple of questions. I'm going to go back to the courtroom when you were in the courtroom with Manson and all, and you were watching some of his shenanigans and his game playings and all that. Do you think that he was just doing that to go for an insanity plea?
No, he wasn't going for an insanity plea at all, Warren, because if he had, he would have pleaded insanity, and he didn't want to plead insanity because during the trial, I spoke to many lawyers representing the girls, and they said the girls are crazy. We want to plead them out, separate them from Manson, and plead them insanity, like Leslie Van Houten, one of the girls in the murders. As soon as Manson heard that, he said, "No, we need a unified front. Insanity is not the way." What I think he was trying to do was to disrupt the court, was to use it as his bizarre playground, and he did, and turned it into a crazy trial. I mean, I've covered many murder trials, and I've covered many crimes in court, and this was the insane, ridiculous, outrageous trial I've ever covered. And the reason was Manson controlled it. He told the girls what to do. Manson was locked up, Warren, all this time, and yet he still controlled the girls and what went on outside the court. It's amazing. But he loved being in control, and I think the control element was what thrilled him.
Yeah, it's amazing what he was able to do with the people that were following him. Unreal to me. Yeah, it was all senseless in my opinion. Did you ever get to go to the scene of the murders? And if so, was it all cleaned up by then, or did you still see the writing on the wall and all that other stuff?
Well, what happened was, strangely enough, I didn't actually go into the house. I did talk to people who went into the house, which was very grisly. But by pure chance, a very good friend of mine lived 3 doors away on Cielo Drive. And so about a year after the murders, I went to see my friend Phil. His name was Phil. His name is Phil. He's still around. He lived 3 doors away. And he told me that sort of day and night, there are looky-loos driving by the gates. Of course, they kept the gates locked. And then I learned that years later, like 10 or 15 years after the murders, the house was absolutely down completely. The address was changed, and a new house was built on the site of Yellow Drive murders. So that's what happened to that house. And the Spahn Movie Ranch burnt down a few years after Manson's arrest. It's still around. I don't know. Many tourists. There are macabre murder tours in Hollywood that drive past Cielo Drive. But as I said a moment ago, Warren, the building, the house, is no longer the murder house. It's a completely new house.
Wow. There's also one thing that I forget the name of the movie. I think it was just called Manson.
Yeah.
But it also showed them in a school bus going through the desert and climbing up a mountain in a school bus. Did that ever happen?
Well, yes, there was a very interesting documentary made a few years after the trial, and it was done by a guy called Robert Hendrickson, and he
Hmm.
had their bus. He had terrific interviews in at the Spahn Ranch with the girls that were not in jail. It even had an interview with Vincent Bugliosi, the prosecutor. Now
Hmm.
that documentary was called Manson, I believe that was the title, and that documentary, believe it or not, was nominated for an Oscar, best documentary, but it didn't win. The one that won was a documentary called Marjo, which was about a young boy. Um, uh, what do they call him? A preacher, a young preacher. So
Right.
the documentary got nominated for an Oscar, in which it had that wonderful footage of life on the ranch with the girls and with Charlie, although Charlie wasn't there, he was in jail at the time. And that's what you're probably talking about, footage of the ranch, the girls talking, the girls fingering rifles and talking about killing and stuff like that. It was quite an eerie, scary documentary, but a very
Yes.
good film.
Yes, it was. That was one of the weirdest movies I ever seen, and it was very interesting though. And
Yes.
it did dig pretty deep into their drug use and all that. So that was just something that was interesting to me. And about the school bus, they were saying that he actually flew it up there, or it floated up the mountain, or because there was no other way they could get that school bus up that mountain.
I mean, you've got to realize that they did have some pretty handy car mechanics like Tex Watson, who worked on taking stolen cars and turning them into dune buggies. So, so they had skilled engineers or skilled car mechanics that could make the bus, put wheels on the bus, that it could go places you would never expect. I'll tell you, on one occasion before the murder, Charlie Manson drove the bus into a ditch and was arrested with the girls before the murders. He was arrested in Ventura, California, and they were charged with being vagrant, but they couldn't prove anything. So Manson and the girls were set free. So Manson took that bus from San Francisco down to L.A., and wherever he went, the bus went.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. All right, I'm going to go off topic here and change the mood a little bit. Um, you wrote a children's book. I believe it's called Love Your Penguin.
It's called Ladies and Gentlemen, the Penguins. And the reason I used that title was my book for children is a spoof um, on the Beatles. And it's about four penguins from the British island of the Falklands, which is in the Atlantic Ocean, 300 miles from Argentina. It's an English island. Who wake up one morning, these penguins, and they decide they wanted to become rock stars, almost as big as the Beatles. And they become, it's kind of a spoof, they become famous rock stars, and they get invited to appear on that great New York variety show, the Ed Pelican Show. After appearing on the Ed Pelican Show, they write songs like I Want to Hold Your Flipper, big hit. And the name of the manager of these penguins is called Brian Fishstein. So I've used my knowledge and everybody's knowledge of the Beatles to do a fun book about four penguins, a musical penguin, and I love it because it does very well at Christmas time. People go and it's just fun. It's beautifully illustrated, and I'm very proud of it.
I would be too, and it sounds like an interesting book, and I believe my grandkids would love to read that.
Well, I tell you what, just send me the address and names, and I will send them.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that very, very kind offer.
Get it to me before Christmas, and I'll get it to you before Christmas.
And I will be glad to exchange some artwork for you also.
That would be terrific. Let's do it. Let's do some bartering, okay, Warren?
That sounds good to me. And speaking of art, who worked with you providing the artwork on your Penguin book?
Well, I had a terrific artist, believe it or not, from Liverpool, who I met through a friend, and he turned out to be a guy who did beautiful illustrations. And when you see the book, you will see what I mean. And he has a great sense of humor, which I like, sense of humor with a children's book, so that not only will the kids enjoy it, but when you read it to your grandkids, you will enjoy it.
That would be really nice. I would like to read it. And I'll get with you after the show on the artwork and everything.
Okay. Yeah, that would be lovely. I don't know what kind of artwork you do. I don't want to.
Yeah, I can. You can go to Warren Brown's art page on Facebook, and you can see some of the art that I do on there.
Okay.
He does really wonderful work, so take him up on it.
I'm gonna look at it. It's Warren Brown on your Facebook page.
Yeah, it's Warren Brown's with the apostrophe S art page.
Okay. And of course it's WARREN.
With the apostrophe S. I'll send you a link after the show, and you can check it out if you like.
Okay. Well, listen, it's been a great pleasure talking to you both. Warren, make sure you do send me that link.
I will do that. And do me a favor before you run off here, and let the fans all out there know where they can find your books and the other work you do.
You can get my children's book. You can get my Beatles book. You can get my Manson book, all at the same place. You can either go to www.ivordavisbooks.com and order it that way, or you can order it on Amazon and hopefully get it in time for Christmas. But if you send it to Ivor Davis Books with a request for a signature, I'll get it to you.
That'd be really nice. And what a great show we had with you tonight, and very interesting and amazing stories.